Well, this is another COP in an authoritarian petro state, which makes it very hard to organize around it. And yet, miraculously, we will find people do actually protest here, and obviously there's UN rules who are obliged to make it possible for people to kind of organize around this space. But it's difficult, and there's very much a sense of insecurity around, and people are very worried about using public Wi-Fi, about their laptops, about internet security, and obviously we're aware of the human rights situation in the country, which is a disaster, frankly.
Why are you here? I mean, are you still given a platform, and how important is it for you now to have a platform to talk about climate issues at an event like COP?
Well, I would say globally we're at quite a decisive point where it could be that we actually manage to phase out fossil fuels, to transition away from what distracts our livelihoods and move towards something that can be more just and more safe. And we're at that crossroads, and the fossil fuel industry is very aware, and so they're bringing the cavalry to this place. They're flooding these halls with fossil fuel lobbyists in an attempt to undermine all the things that were achieved and to undermine climate science, climate negotiations, and obviously also shrink civil society space. And so if we as activists don't show up here, we're giving even more space to those lobbyists and their befriended governments. So we're trying to be here to hold that space that we fought for so hard, to make sure that there's a counterforce to that fossil fuel lobbyism that is trying to reclaim that quite crucial space here.
Some climate activists, heated, for example, the newsletter from the United States last week just said 1.5 is dead. Would you say 1.5 is dead? Basically, there's no chance now?
Well, behind the 1.5 degree target, there's a climate science, and it's up to that science to tell us what's going on. But we're seeing this year for the first time we could actually break through 1.5 as a global average temperature rise, which is a disaster. And yet I would consider the 1.5 degree target in the Paris Agreement to be much more than just a temperature line. It's a promise that we as a global community give to the world and the future and the most vulnerable people around the world. And that promise says we're watching and we're caring and we're giving it everything we can, and we're fighting for every centigrade that we can fight for. And that promise is very well alive, and these halls are a bit of a testament to that, because people do show up even in the darkest times.
It is dark times. We're going to be soon at 422 ppm this year, expected. It's still CO2 emissions, the methane emissions are rising. Greenhouse gas concentrations are rising in the atmosphere. You could argue that your movement, the movement that came from Al Gore, the movement from the 1960s, put environmental issues on the agenda, but we haven't fixed the problem.
I think the most important thing to maybe know about this climate story that we're writing is that we just never know what could have happened otherwise. So we don't know where we would be without the Paris Agreement, without the green movements around the world, without the youth climate movement. We just don't know. We have some science, though, that tells us we would be at a drastically different point. Our commitment to watch closely what's happened, to care for each other, is not about creating this perfect utopia, but it's about implementing a global mode of trying as hard as we can, fighting as hard as we can, understanding that change is a process that is not linear, but it has ups and downs, and there are moments when acceleration is possible, when we reach social tipping points, when suddenly, like in 2019's, elections are being won through the climate, and there are times like these times where it's harder to see the hope, where it's easier to kind of fall for cynicism. And yet when we watch and we look closely at global kind of human history, cynicism is quite unrealistic, scientifically spoken, because however dark it is, people tend to still care, and people tend to group up and do very unexpected miracles.
The science is clear. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. We can have no new expansion of fossil fuels if we want to have even a remote chance of limiting temperatures well below 1.5 degrees C. And of course, we're on a trajectory of a catastrophic warming of 3 degrees. But it's also true that messages to the global south to cut their fossil fuels, whilst there's massive expansion in the US, in Canada, and Australia, the UK and the European, sends totally the wrong signal. That's why we need a fair, just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels, and we need the technology transfers and the finance for all countries to leave their fossil fuels in the ground and to grow cleanly.
Do you think Aliyev is right to carry on expanding?
No country's right to go carry on expanding. Absolutely not. And so we must also recognise this is a global problem. The only way everybody moves is if you know that it's done fairly. And he's right that the signals that need to happen, of course, need to happen from the very, very big polluters, those that have been polluting for over 100 years. And so what the United States does, what the European Union does, what the UK does, matters, because that sends a signal.